I first discovered the book on a rainy day during early fall of last year in Kobe. Kobe is the area located in Japan for those who don't know. Being deeply interested in literature and the occult, I was drawn to second-hand bookshops since the beginning of my stay. I was working as a part-time English teacher after I abused my visa to receive legal residence, which freed up a lot of my time to research and generally pursue my own hobbies. After getting settled in, I dug around on 2chan to locate the occult. 2chan consisted of many chats about the occult, which were generally included in many posts by anonymous users. People shared information about strange news, certain locations where ghost sightings occurred, coordinates to find abandoned places, as well as some interesting information about the deep web. Most of the chats were jokes, I think, and some malicious at that. Due to the anonymity, some people intentionally gave you coordinates to dangerous areas. It was a rainy morning when I was stretched out on my bed watching TV and idly browsing the chat on 2chan. Most people were bitching about the weather, and more than a few were cracking jokes about rain ghosts. When I was searching through 2chan, I realised I received a private message from a guy I knew on 2chan. He said, "There's something terrible at the Kinomiya bookstore. It's about 10 minutes away from Sanomiya station. You will find it on the third shelf to the left." Kinomiya is a small second-hand bookstore run by an elderly couple at the basement of a large department store. I had been there many times as they sold international books translated to Japanese for times I wanted to revisit some stories. International books averaged around 3,000 yen for a brand new copy, and the elderly couple also gave me hefty discounts at half the price. Thinking that I had nothing to lose, besides getting a little wet by the rain, I ate a simple breakfast and made my way to Sanomiya station. Nothing was different when I entered Kinomiya. The musty smell of old books, cigarettes and old coffee was the same as always. Aging, sagging, wooden shelves supported large volumes that definitely voided their manufacturer's warranties. The elderly couple immediately struck up a conversation the minute I entered the door, offering me a smoke and some coffee. I sat down with the elderly couple, and we talked lightly of television shows, why I'm still not married, I'm only 23, is not a valid reason apparently, and of course, books. The elderly Oba-san, which basically means old woman in Japanese, was a lover of fantasy and romance, while the Oji-san, the word for old man in Japanese, was a lover of historical novels, particularly of the Meiji era. It was when our conversation centered around books. I asked him if he had encountered any strange books. The Oba-san's face blanched suddenly, and the old man threw back his head and laughed, much to my surprise. He skirted the question for a few minutes, then told me this. Books, some believe, are windows to other worlds, but that's not necessarily true. If the book is poorly written, yes, it can only serve as a window, but a well-written book, on the other hand, will put you in that world. The conversation kind of petered out there, and I finished my coffee and cigarettes. I returned to browsing the bookshelves and noticed that for the first time the old couple was watching me closely. They were quite discreet about it. I doubt they thought I would steal any books, but being an NYC native, I know when I'm being watched by some store owners. Nonetheless, I slipped out of their view to the shelf that the message had told me about. I had never stolen anything in my life, yet for reasons unknown I quietly slipped a book from the bottom shelf into my bag. After saying my farewells and stating that there was nothing that caught my attention today, the old couple seemed to return to their normal duties. They waved me out the door and told me to stop by any time for coffee and a chat. I promised that I would. I decided to take the bus back to my apartment. The rain had increased to a steady downpour and my umbrella felt heavy from the amount of endless water. It was only on the empty bus when I opened up my bag to look at the book that I had stolen. There was something strange about the book. The book didn't have a title. I arrived home with my precious cargo. At that point, had I really expected to find anything of the occult? Absolutely not. Due to the watchful gaze of the elderly couple, the best thing I could do was just grab a book, any book. Now that I had illegally procured a book, I scanned over the untitled cover. I originally believed the cover to be made of leather, which had hardened over time into brittleness. But after close inspection, what I discovered instead was that the book had an aged wooden cover with a traditionally carved illustration. I was immediately overjoyed. This book had to be a kusazoshi. For those unversed in Japanese literary history, kusazoshi were books written during the Edo era mainly, with some written even before the Edo period. Kusazoshi isn't exactly the pinnacle of Japanese literature, but are extremely difficult to find in this day and age. Actual kusazoshi, and not reprints, are kept in many museums and are hardly ever found in second-hand bookstores. Kusazoshi are divided into different colours, which denote themes. There are blue, red, yellow, and black books. The book I was dealing with was a kurohon, a black book. Kurohon deals with mature themes, usually great myths of the demons, particularly those that were written during the early 1800s. The cover was rather unremarkable though. I was not exactly able to guess which type of wood the cover was made of, but the book had suffered some damage. The corners were warped slightly, and the border facing the binding was cracked in a few places, but the engravings on the cover constituting the illustration was in marvellous condition. The engraving was a sleepy village nestled between two mountains, with thick bamboo groves surrounding it. For reasons unknown, the engraving produced goosebumps all over my arms. When I flipped the wooden cover, I would be lying if I said I didn't scream like a little girl. A yellowed slip of paper fell out of the book and into my lap. I have translated the note to the best of my ability, and unfortunately I have not made a note of the original Japanese in my notes. This is the last remaining copy of the story known as Gozu, a tale of terror and desperation. It is a story with no morals, messages, or treasures to the reader. Its content is malicious, the writer is unknown, and the owners lost. It offers nothing and takes everything. Showa 40, 1965. Although now I have familiarized myself with Gozu, I could hardly take the note seriously. How could the Japanese equivalent of Bigfoot be found at a small second-hand bookstore in Kobe? I'd be more prone to believe a far-fetched conspiracy story of the Japanese government holding a vault of cursed relics. While the story was written in Japanese, that is far from the modern form, it was mostly written in hiragana, which made the going easier than I had initially feared. With my limited knowledge of literature during that period, it still came across something that was not usually found within kusazoshi. After the flyleaf, there seemed to be a record of what appeared to be the villagers concerning their story. Now, this wasn't particularly odd. Buddhist temples since the 1600s in Japan used to keep detailed consensus records. Kusazoshi, particularly kurohon, were usually set in fiction, and the names listed within the consensus bore no relations with any particular famous names or places throughout Japanese history. After carefully scanning the consensus page, I took a deep breath and opened another bag of chips, and settled in for the story of a lifetime. Gozu began with the village depicted on the cover as the central setting, mainly going over the village's internal economy and state of life. While for some historians this would be a treasure trove of information for cultural studies, Japan recorded its history early on since 900 AD, so there was nothing within the immediate beginning that seemed to be a unique find. The village, which simply called itself village in the book, was surrounded by a thick grove of bamboos on to the east, west and north, with mountains to the south. This effectively made travel nigh impossible, as it took a strong man a day to traverse through the bamboo groves. The mountains would take a strong man 3 days and would lead to nowhere but the coast and sea. The people of the village followed their own version of the Bakefu system, a system modelled upon the shogunate. But since they were isolated from any direct contact with the high court, had to fend for itself. Being isolated meant the village was unharmed during the slew of the civil wars and uprisings that followed, but it also meant that during times of famine or pestilence they could not rely on the central government for support. The village subsisted mainly on their small rice paddies on land they were able to clear of bamboo, and some small domesticated livestock. Many of the villagers were afraid to step too deep into the bamboo groves, as it was easy to lose track of oneself. Thus, small game and foraging for wild foodstuff was generally kept to a minimum. The village carried on its peaceful tranquility when during a rather rough summer the village was struck a crippling blow. Both their rice crops and livestock began to wither and die. While from the explanations it was quite obvious to the modern reader that the rice was hit with bacterial blight and the livestock began to suffer from lung disease, the villagers jumped to the conclusion that the gods must not be pleased. The village council decided that it was too rash to begin invoking any spirits or rites to deal with the problem, and decided to try and tough out the remainder of the time till the next harvest season. When fall arrived and the harvest provided much more meagre stocks than previously anticipated, many people in the village began to brave entering the bamboo groves to forage for wild mushrooms and tender bamboo shoots, as well as hunt and trap wild game. The village stockpiled their foraging together, and it seemed that while the oncoming winter was not pleasant, no great famine would strike. As the foraging carried on, the wild foodstuff growing closest to the village was the first to be depleted. The village quickly devised a system to forage deeper in the bamboo groves and minimizing the chance of getting lost. The women wove a thin yet durable hemp rope, woven together so compactly that it was almost invisible to the naked eye unless the sunlight caught on it. They would tie it to the shrine at the center of the village and, holding the rest of the rope coiled in one hand, venture into the grove. The women were able to produce 3 long ropes in total. Each rope was long enough for a person to encircle the entire village 7 times before running taut. The system was a success. Holding onto the coil, the foragers were able to carefully retrace their tracks even during the dead of night. While some complained of broken noses caused by accidentally walking into bamboo trees head first, that really wasn't that much of a problem. However, this new system came to a screeching halt when one of the young women of the village, Aguri, entered the grove early one morning. Around midday, when the sun was the hottest, the men of the village were sitting together near the shade of the grove, cursing the blight and disease. Aguri came dashing out of the grove, her clothes in tatters and her usually well done hair in disarray. Although the men called out to her in surprise, she would not stop running. The village attempted for 3 days to nurse Aguri back to health. She would not stop mumbling about something in the woods that was trying to track her down. On the 3rd day, she wailed so loudly that the families at the edge of the village heard her. Many rushed to Aguri's house to see and found her aged mother, her only family member, kneeling on the front porch sobbing. Aguri had taken the hemp rope and hung herself. After comforting the mother, the village council was finally able to procure an answer from Aguri's mother. Aguri had found a small rope in the bamboo grove, and much to her surprise, found a large ginseng growing by a batch of light green bamboo shoots. The ginseng, at that size, would be potent enough to cure any disease or ailment, or so they believed, and the bamboo shoots of the colour were highly prized, their taste akin to white rice. Aguri thanked the gods and took to harvesting when she noticed something watching her. Aguri had called it Gozu, and the mother was unsure where she had heard such a name. The mother never told any stories of the supernatural, as that invoked bad spirits. Aguri described it as a broad man, twice as broad as any man in the village, with great rippling muscles. However, his head was that of a cow. Aguri had dropped all the bamboo shots and even the ginseng, holding onto the hemp rope as tightly as she could while she ran. The Gozu began to run alongside her, and Aguri had stared into the cow's eyes. Aguri noticed that the Gozu was not staring at her, but rather the hemp rope she was holding. The Gozu then ran quicker than her, disappearing into the grove, his hand holding onto the hemp rope. Aguri had committed suicide, not out of fear but out of guilt. She knew that if she had cut the hemp rope before the Gozu had disappeared, the Gozu would have never been able to find the village. She felt that she had been responsible for leading the Gozu back to the village. After hearing the mother's story, the village council became silent. Everyone in the village began to hotly debate the next course of action to take after Aguri's demise. As much as the council tried to keep the incident that occurred in the grove a secret, the news spread throughout the entire village before nightfall. When nightfall finally came, the men wore white hoods and carried the brightly burning torches. In the midst of them was a corpse covered with a simple white shroud. Aguri's body. The council had deeply debated how to handle the situation at hand, and it was unanimously voted that her body was to be disposed of in the woods. There were two reasons. She had committed a dishonourable suicide, and she could find no repose in her family grave. The council also secretly hoped that disposing of Aguri in this manner would appease whatever creature lived in the woods. The men held a simple rite for Aguri. She was a rather plain and honest girl, and there was not much to say. The men returned to the village before long, their hoods draped around their shoulders. For a while the village returned to its old lifestyle. The groves were now forbidden to enter, and the council held sentry from the shrine. 2 out of the 3 ropes had been coiled back from the bamboo forest. The one Aguri had taken with her on the fateful day remained out in the forest though. The men were afraid of what they would find if they tried to recoil it. The village had managed to supplement their meagre harvest with the bounty of the groves, and it had seemed that peace had returned to the village. But this all changed when Aguri stumbled back out of the grove and into the village. It was at this point in the book that I heard my doorbell chime. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The chips I had forgotten on my lap spilled all over the floor. I rushed to the door, feeling uneasy. Checking through the peephole, I was relieved to see it was my friend, Oshino Meme. His family owned a temple in a nearby area. He was much more deeply versed in East Asian culture and folklore than me, and I saw him something akin to a mentor. Meme stepped into the room, ignoring the chips and stepping directly onto them. He was a rather hard friend to like. I cracked open a few beers while we discussed our day. I conveniently left out everything that had happened since the message earlier that morning. I gave a half-assed story about being locked in a porn coma for the majority of the day. He snorted. We spoke of work, the shows we caught the night before, and sooner or later the topic drifted back to the paranormal. That was when I thought of a perfectly safe question to ask him regarding Gozu. I asked him if there were any legends or particularly held superstitions regarding forests, groves, or nature. For a moment he appeared to be in deep thought. I have transcribed his answer as best as I can. Meme began to speak. Forests exist everywhere around the world, you know. Well, most parts where people began to live in anyways. Every culture or people in the world that had some kind of dense foliage near the birth of their civilization, warn of following the call of your voice into the woods. It's odd, even us Japanese have a version of it. We believe that they are malicious foxes that call someone's name, usually in the voice of a loved one, to bewitch them further and further away from a safe path and into the woods. They lead the traveller to their demise, then assume their shape to wreak havoc. Meme finished his beer and began to get up. I walked with him back to my front door, wishing him a good night and thanking him for his information. It was not exactly an answer I was looking for in relation to what happened to Gozu, but it set even more gears clicking in my head, and I returned to the book. The village was in uproar at the return of Aguri. The priests of the shrine were baffled, the council was at a loss of words, and a mother was overjoyed. Aguri had stumbled on trembling legs from the bamboo groves she was cast into, the dark purple bruise of the rope evident on her neck. Some wanted to burn Aguri, claiming that she was possessed of the evil spirits that curse the groves. Others claimed that she would have come for revenge and refused to leave the sacred grounds of the shrine. Village life was once again disrupted, and at the same time snow began to fall. Aguri's mother had barricaded her home from the more violent villagers, claiming that her daughter simply had not been dead but unconscious. Only the men of the village would stop like clockwork to drop off firewood and food. It was during the height of the snowing period that some villagers fell deathly sick. The book described the conditions of what could be guessed as pneumonia. The snow was particularly bad that year, falling up to a man's chest in some spots. The medicine painstakingly acquired through travel to other distant towns and villages seemed to dry up overnight. Yoshitsu, the village chief's son, recalled one particularly somber evening, Aguri speaking of finding a rather large ginseng, and he set his heart to find it. The council and his friends tried to dissuade him, calling it suicide. Besides, they argued, how could he find it with so much snowfall? Yoshitsu knew that the hemp rope had not been coiled, and reasoned that the end of the rope would be more or less the location of the ginseng. Yoshitsu then showed his daughter to his friends. Her face had turned purple from the illness. No one again reasoned with Yoshitsu not to go, but neither did they offer to join him. Yoshitsu had considered asking Aguri to join him, but traversing the snowy grove with someone who may be a possessed corpse didn't seem like a good idea. Yoshitsu picked a light meal of grilled rice wrapped in steaming bamboo leaves and a few strips of dried squirrel jerky. He set out at daybreak, the hemp rope guiding him through the grove. He walked for most of the morning, marvelling that Aguri was able to walk this far even during the summer. He ate his lunch, sat for a few minutes, enjoying the feeling of a full stomach and the peaceful quiet of the grove. Saving a small leaf from the pile of kindling, he began to whistle a soft tune. Yoshitsu jumped when a man's voice hailed him from nearby, asking if it may join him by the fire. Yoshitsu's mind began to race of stories from his youth, of beautiful women that were trapped in the snow that tried to drag young men to their deaths, as well as of old men with no teeth that waited for young men to fall asleep to drink their blood. Before Yoshitsu could respond, an old man with a wispy white beard, his body wrapped with a fake brown robe, sat in the snow by Yoshitsu, warming his liver-spotted hands over the small fire. The old man gave Yoshitsu a genuinely kind smile, putting him at ease. The man's bald head gave Yoshitsu further assurance. It must be a travelling Buddhist monk. Yoshitsu offered the Buddhist monk the last grilled rice cake he had been saving for his return trip, which he graciously accepted. The old monk munched away happily at the rather plain meal, even going as far as licking the remnants of the sauce off the bamboo leaves. The monk burped and carefully cast the now clean bamboo leaves into the fire, where it soon caught and began to disintegrate. Yoshitsu and the monk watched silently as the fire once again died down to embers. The monk asked Yoshitsu his reasoning for being in the groves in such a treacherous weather, and Yoshitsu began to confide everything to the monk. The monk listened sagely and showed no surprise at what had befallen Aguri. After Yoshitsu had concluded his story, and his reason for being in the woods became apparent, the monk spoke. The Gozu is a rather strange creature, he said. He falls neither into the realm of Japanese Shinto, nor is ever spoken about in the different narakas within Buddhism. I have never encountered such a creature, but all I can offer is this talisman and of course my prayers for your village. Yoshitsu accepted the small amulet, which was shaped like a small golden monocle. The glass of the monocle, however, instead of being clear, was a deep red. Yoshitsu and the monk both stood up, dusting stray snow off their clothes. Yoshitsu offered the monk the best of luck, and their sentiment was returned. They both parted ways again. The monk headed in the direction of Yoshitsu's village, and Yoshitsu followed the hemp rope. After walking a few steps, Yoshitsu realized he never asked the monk on how to use the amulet. Yoshitsu turned around, but the monk had already vanished. All he saw was a small fox scampering off deeper into the grove. I put the book down thoughtfully. I had not even realized it was nearing 4 in the morning. I had been enthralled in the book and did not eat or even use the bathroom. I realized something terrifying. The book did not seem to diminish in content. I felt, after all the pages that I had read, I had barely made a dent in all the passages. I marked into my diary the estimated page of the book, as there were no page numbers anywhere. I decided that both the story and the book was giving me the creeps, and called Meme to come clean. The phone rang for a while, so I was worried that he might not be there at the temple. I listened intently, unsure if I should even leave a message, but he picked up on the 15th ring. He was really annoyed, royally pissed. He was having a great dream that he was driving along the highway and blasting demons with energy bolts leaning out the side of the truck. I wasn't terribly sorry for waking up when I heard that. I told Meme about everything. The story I had read so far, the fact that I was indeed holding the last remaining copy of Gozu, and what had happened in the book so far. Meme listened intently, and I heard the faint scribble of him taking notes. He promised that he would get on the bus first thing in the morning. He also told me under no circumstances I should open that book again. I agreed, and he said he would ask his father, as this was dealing with something he had no knowledge of. I cracked a joke about an ancient evil, but Meme shut me up quickly. He went on to say, "There's no such thing as an ancient evil. Evil existed in the hearts of men before they were men. Think of the way that the universe works. Everything is out intent on destroying each other. Evil caused the universe. Hell, we can argue that evil created the universe. Men could not clamber towards enlightenment in peace. Look at the Catholic religion. Men become revered when they stand against great evil, or are taken by ancient evils. We understand the concept of beauty because we want to turn our heads away from evil. Yet, evil is sometimes more beautiful than anything. I can argue that the concept ancient good is more correct than ancient evil. This book is not an ancient evil. It has always existed. Evil just takes forms, and I believe it has existed before the beginning of anything. Anyways, I'll be there in the morning, so stay away from that fucking book." I reconfirmed my intentions to stay away from the book, and he hung up. I yawned, and I felt the fatigue of spending the entire day reading the book. I decided to brew a cup of coffee. All I recall was opening the tin for a quick cup of instant coffee, and setting the kettle on the stove. I remember adding my preference of sugar to the cup and beginning to open the carton of milk. I remember closing my eyes for a second, a full-bodied yawn fighting up its way from my chest. I left my eyes closed for a second, the coolness of the carton feeling oddly comforting. When I opened my eyes, the book was back in my hands. A soft, disbelieving sigh escaped from my lips. I looked down and was astounded at what I saw. The entire book so far had been densely packed with letters. The writer seemed intent to stuff as much information as possible into the book. Now I noticed that the words were beautifully spaced and the calligraphy had become much more even. The delicate brush strokes looked like a work of art. There were now illustrations bordering the pages. I began to flip from the beginning of the book, and there were amazing detailed drawings throughout the margins and borders of the pages. There was an illustration of women weaving the hemp rope, Yoshitsu navigating through the snow, and Aguri's feet showing at the top border. And there was also a drawing of the Gozu. I was shocked. The flyleaf I was certain that had previously been blank had a full-scale drawing of the Gozu. Its black, bovine eyes stared directly out of the page and into my terrified eyes. I quickly found my place again within the book, which also confirmed my worst fears. I was still at the same place as I had started last night. I had to continue reading. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop. There must be an answer to this madness. Yoshitsu trekked on deeper into the grove, and the going got slightly easier. The thicker bamboo at the heart of the grove had shielded some of the snowfall. It had not made a huge difference, but now Yoshitsu was able to take off his snowshoes, which greatly sped up his trek. Snow began to fall again lightly. Yoshitsu tightly clutched on the rope in one hand, pulling it slightly every now and again to put it away from the heavy snow. He recalled that Aguri said that she had found ginseng and bamboo shoots at a slight slope. In the distance up ahead, he saw the snow beginning to gradually incline. He slowed down and cautiously began to approach the slope. As he neared the base of the slope, he noticed that the sound of the forest had dimmed. The sound of the wind sighing softly among the bamboo, the calls of small birds, and even the crunch of his shoes on the soft top layer of the snow seemed to gradually lessen. With his heart pounding, he began to crouch, afraid of something that may be watching him from the wood. He cursed himself silently for not wearing his winter hunting gear. He was wearing travel gear which were bright and distinctive. He was wearing it so search parties could locate him easily in the event that he lost his trail. Yoshitsu began to worry. The rope was still taut, although he was sure that he was beginning to near Aguri's final destination. It should have been slacking, since Aguri had never mentioned mooring the rope to anything. He arrived at the base of the slope, and taking a deep breath, pulled hard on the rope. A frozen, decomposing hand suddenly shot out from the snow. Someone pushed me hard from behind, causing me to drop the book. Meme pushed me out of the way and shut my stove off. I left the kettle on, and it had boiled the last of the water and began to blacken. I began to cough at the intense amount of smoke in the kitchen. He took the kettle and left it on my veranda. The kettle was still smoking. Meme opened every door in the house as well as the windows and disabled my fire alarm. I had not even noticed that it had been going off. After doing all of this, he helped himself to some milk in my fridge and a donut on the kitchen table. I noticed that the milk had been untouched and the carton still closed. I sat down on the kitchen floor and began to shiver. I didn't understand a single thing that was going on. It felt like the last 2 days of my life had been absolutely dominated by the book. I corrected myself. It didn't feel like it. My life had been completely dominated by the book. I closed my eyes and tried to control my shivering. Meme just continued eating my breakfast. The munching sound seemed to anchor me back to reality, but all I could still think about was the accursed book. I had to know what happened next. I got up, my pants reeking. I realised at that point that I shit myself. I steadied myself over the counter, where the book remained closed. I had to know what happened within the story. Without turning around, I told Meme I really needed a shave and that I was going to wash myself. He grunted while destroying an entire dozen box of donuts. I quietly slipped the book into the front of my pants. I began to leave the kitchen and head to the bathroom when he lazily called my name. I turned around and he beckoned me to come closer. When I did, he suddenly reached into my pants, causing me to yelp in surprise. He had dug the book out of my pants. With a weak chuckle, I went to the bathroom, throwing my pyjama pants into the wash and decided to just chuck the underwear. The hot shower calmed me more than usual, and I sat soaking in the spray of water, wondering what was to befall Yoshitsu. Was the corpse Aguri's? Was the Gozu a shapeshifter? The Japanese equivalent of a goatsman, maybe? I had to finish the story. There was no other way around it. I had to know the fate that befell the village. I finished up in the shower and quickly shaved. With a clean pair of underwear on, I stepped back into the kitchen. Meme called me from the living room. I sadly closed a now empty box of donuts and an empty milk carton. Upon entering the room, I was astounded at what I saw. Meme had set up a strange contraption using two mirrors that I kept for different purposes. He had laid Gozu directly in the middle, and two mirrors of differing sizes and heights. He had taken my convex mirror and placed it directly in front of the opposite chair from where he was sitting, so when I took a seat, it completely blocked me from looking at the book directly. A small mirror, about 3 inches in height, with no base I had received as a gift, was placed in an angle so that I could get a look at the reflection the convex cast. In short, I had no direct view of the book, but I could still see it. Meme lit a cigarette and blew a cloud of blue smoke. The smoke reminded me that I, a heavy smoker, had not had a cigarette in 2 days. I lit one of my own. We smoked in silence until our cigarettes burned down to the filter. After we extinguished our cigarettes, Meme wordlessly began to arrange everything on the table. I had closed my eyes for a while he did this. I felt that I would collapse at any moment. My eyes began to focus in the hazy living room. Dawn had already broken and the room was bathed in light purple. I gasped when I noticed what Meme had set up. The reflections of the small mirror showed Gozu, or what I thought was Gozu. The materials of the book had not changed at all. The cracks and slight warping of the wood had remained the same, and the wood still slightly gleamed in the purple light. But the engraving had completely changed. The engraving now showed 3 monks bowed in prayer, and they had the markings of sainthood radiating from their heads. I gripped the edge of the table and the room began to spin. Meme snorted. "Did you find anything in the book?" I replied that I hadn't, but then I recalled the yellow slip of paper that slipped out. I told him that it was now tucked securely in the back of the book. Meme ignored me and flicked the cover to the flyleaf. The yellow piece of paper was there. Meme read the yellow piece of paper out aloud. Entombed within is the only known completed copy of Jujushinron, which translates to 10 stages of the developed mind. It is written by none other than the great Kobadaishi, or better known as Kukai. It is the holiest script known to man, and guarantees the end of human suffering and the ultimate path to enlightenment. Dated Kamakura year 15, 1200 AD. I fell from my chair, unconscious, while I was plagued by uneasy dreams. I awoke hours later. It was already evening. The entire right side of my body was sore beyond belief, and my stomach growled. I stumbled to the kitchen to find a mess and most of the contents of my fridge gone. Meme was sitting in the dining room table, finishing the last of my ice cream. I asked him where the book was. He didn't answer. Before I could stop myself or even really understand what was happening, my fist had connected with his lower jaw, smacking his temple into the wall. Blood welled into his right eye from the blow. He unleashed the worst ass whipping I had ever received to date. I tell my friends now that I gave as much as I got, but in reality, I learned that day what it meant to get my ass beaten. When we were both left gasping on the floor, with the last of my strength I muttered to him in English that he was a cheap monk knockoff. He replied back to me, "This is the pen," and smacked me in my forehead. He didn't know how to speak English at all. He lit a cigarette and ashed it directly onto my floor. After smoking the cigarette halfway, while I was counting the bones that were left unbroken in my upper body, he began to speak. "Listen, that book, if I can call it that, isn't Gozu. Gozu doesn't exist. It's an urban legend told by morons on 2chan and other places on the internet. It's evil alright, but it's far from being an ancient evil. It's a physical manifestation of desire. It simply wants to consume your soul and lead you to ruin. This isn't a book. A book is a piece of an artist's soul. No, this isn't a book. This is a twisted parody of a book. It shows you only what you want to see." After that he smoked in silence. After the last 2 days, I was glad for the silence. It's been a few weeks since Meme took the book home with him. I argued with him at first and got desperate enough to say the whole "I found it first" spiel. He told me that it would be better if I didn't know where it was kept. I guess it was all for the better. I revisited Kinomiya a few days ago. Things are the same as always. Both the store and the couple are still ancient, and I hope that those things will never change. I came clean to the older couple about stealing the book. I had formally prepared 5,000 yen in an unmarked envelope to attempt to display my grievances for what I had committed, but they refused the money. The old man knew what I had taken. Knew it from the look in my eyes, he had told me. I guess it's cliché, but I guess staring into the abyss really does change a person. I still have uneasy dreams from time to time. I try not to dwell on the characters I read about, but it's difficult. I swear sometimes I could draw Yoshitsu's face from my memory. Me and Meme went to our favourite watering hole. We sat munching on 2 plates of raw fish and grilled chicken, occasionally popping edamame beans into our mouth. We hadn't talked much since the run-in with the book. We drank and ate in silence, and only opened our mouths to say farewells at the station. I still wonder what fate had befallen the villagers. Had the book really spun them out of my twisted imagination? There was a desperation I felt from the pit of my stomach. The willingness to know consumed me. I began to write furiously. I don't know about what or why, it felt like there was an invisible pressure building up inside of me, and the only way I could relieve it was to write. For days at a time I locked myself in my apartment, the words coming unbidden from my fingertips. Whether I had a pen or poised in my hands over a keyboard, it didn't matter. Hell, it didn't even matter what language I wrote it in. Manuscripts in Korean, English and Japanese began to fill up my room. Meme unexpectedly visited me one day while I was in the depth of my writing. He was worried that I had become possessed or something, but I barely heeded him. I continued my writing before it felt that my head was about to catch on fire. It turns out that I had been possessed. The discovery of Gozu had put larger things into motion, and I wish I could recount all of the wondrous, terrible things I was able to participate with alongside my mentor. But I think that's probably a story for another time.